Welcome to the last lecture of Unit 6. This is Workers in America. 6.06 is the target. So in this lecture, we'll be looking at the effect of the robber barons on unions and how workers tried to sort of create a space for themselves where they could be more successful in getting power and in getting control over the industries in which they were forced to work for low wages. There's several reasons why industry and labor are in great conflict in the Gilded Age. The industrialists believe that wealth is naturally going to be unequal, that there's not going to be a middle sort of way for everyone where we're all roughly in the same place. And in fact, they welcome great inequalities in wealth. Super, super wealthy, super, super poor is just a sign of the natural order. They argue that property is sacred and that once a person gets property or gets wealth, it shouldn't be taken away from him or her. And they really focus a lot on individual rights. So the monopolists, the robber barons, will talk about their rights, their contributions, and their hard work, so themselves as individuals. On the other hand, labor will talk about inequality as being dangerous. They will say that in a democracy, there should be broad, rough equality between all the various peoples, so that everybody can play on a fairly level playing field, politically speaking, and that some people don't have enough money to buy more power and more influence than others. These ideas, of course, go back to Andrew Jackson and his talk about the money power, which is dangerous to the institutions of America. They also say in the unions that labor must be valued. So they don't talk just in terms of property, they talk about the work that laborers provide. You know, the wealth of an Andrew Carnegie or a John D. Rockefeller is not possible without the sweat and labor of the guys who worked in those factories. Labor unions also talk about rights being collective. They point out that no individual in any society anywhere solely gets ahead on his or her own work or labor. Everyone depends on someone else. Even the person who works from nothing still depends on a system that helps and rewards his work. The government designs the rules so that you can get ahead in life. And so really the unions think about rights being collective more than individual. The two of these collide, and the result is pretty explosive. Starting first with a series of strikes against the big companies, starting in 1877. As you can see from the map, strikes are going to occur in the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, all in the North, Maryland, Pennsylvania. There'll be a strike in Chicago, and then another one in 1894, but not many in the South. Notice strikes are not really common in the South. So you see all the counties in the South with pink, not a whole lot of strike and union activity, but much more common up north. And of course, that goes back to the antebellum period. This is an area where there's a lot of farming. This is an area with a lot of industry. So the sectional difference between the two regions is going to continue on into the 20th century. The first major strike, the first national strike in United States history that affects more than just a local group of people is the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. This strike was ended by court order and federal troops after it turned very, very violent. There were 12 days of fighting, 100 people dead, and $10 million in damage when the railroad companies decided to cut wages. And cutting wages is almost always going to be the trigger that leads to a strike. So newspapers were filled with images showing the strikers being destructive and attacking and going against the owners of the railroads. The next major strike is Haymarket, 1886. Haymarket was a meeting of working people at which someone, we don't know who, threw a bomb. In the aftermath of that bomb incident, there were 7 people dead and 67 injured. Almost right away, the public blamed the unions for the violence. Even if we don't exactly know who threw the bomb, it didn't really matter because the workers, the unions, were seen as causing and encouraging violent behavior. So here's an illustration of the bomb going off. (1892) is Homestead. Wages were cut by Andrew Carnegie, who owned the Homestead factory. And then Carnegie hired 300 private guards, not policemen, not military officials, but private eyes, private investigators, so ordinary guys who were working for a company and who carried guns. And these 300 private guards were going to break the strike. So predictably, there was a fight. People were shooting each other. There was a lot of violence. And eventually, the governor of Pennsylvania sent in troops to stop this strike. Here's an illustration of the violence outside of Homestead. Fights between workers and the 300 private guards were quite deadly. Our last example of a labor-industry conflict is the Pullman strike of 1894. Once again, wages were cut in the middle of an economic depression, and the Pullman men resisted, went on strike. This time, the strike was ended by a court order. And interestingly enough about this court order is that it was supported by a law originally intended to break monopolies. In 1890, Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, which would have broken up any monopoly that restrained trade. Instead of using the Sherman Antitrust Act against monopolies, courts turned the act against unions. In the end, by 1894, we can see that in the contest between industry and labor, industry is almost always going to win. Industry has money. They're rich, so they can outlast the striking workers. Industry has political connections. Almost all of the strikes are ended through court orders or the president or a governor intervening. And industry has the ability to hire cheap immigrants to replace the striking workers. So in every situation, industry, monopoly is so powerful that it's able to be much more successful. It has a lot more weapons, a lot more protection. Meanwhile, the poor working people living in poverty and carrying very weak weapons are not able to come out on top. So the key points. In all of the striking situations, in contests between labor and industry, industry almost always wins. The large labor supply meant that the industries could always find more workers. So cheap immigrants get off the boats, they get hired immediately, they don't need to have skills, so they can be put to work. And unions, for that reason, are not going to like immigrants, but factory owners will. The government was in fact not laissez-faire. In most cases, the government actually intervened to help the industries, to help the robber barons. And there is a public image problem for unions. Most people in the public saw the unions as radicals and dangerous, as threats to America, rather than part of the American fabric with ideas that were important. So keep these points in mind. Roughly the same thing is going to happen again and again and again. Wages will be cut, workers will go on strike, strike will be crushed. Over time, this becomes the dominant pattern in American history.